The ruins of the border outpost still burned when Sergeant Mason stepped through the smoke, carrying his rifle low and his eyes sharp. He had come late to the scene after the pirate raid had already turned everything to ash and silence. The comms were down, the squad spread thin, but Mason heard a sound under the crackle of fire. It was soft like a whimper, and it came from the collapsed supply shelter. He moved toward it, ignoring the voice of his lieutenant echoing over the short range, telling everyone to regroup at the shuttle. The sound drew him closer until he saw the small figure crouched in the corner, half buried under fallen panels. A thin girl with pale blue skin and silver eyes, her face streaked with dust and tears. At first Mason thought she was dead, but then her fingers twitched and she looked at him with a mix of terror and hope. He knelt slowly and took off his helmet, showing his face to prove he was not a pirate or a raider. It was strange how the fear in her eyes shifted. When she saw him, he had seen that look before in refugees and war children on half a dozen worlds, but never in someone not human. She whispered something in her own language and flinched when a beam groaned overhead. Mason spoke gently, telling her he would not hurt her, that he was here to help. She did not seem to understand, but she reacted to the tone of his voice, and when he extended his hand, she hesitated, then placed her small, trembling fingers in his. The moment he lifted her from the wreckage, the roof gave way. He turned his body to shield her from falling debris and felt pain slice across his back, but he did not let go. Outside, the air smelled of burning fuel and ozone. The rest of the squad was already gone, following orders to withdraw. Mason looked at the girl and then at the empty sky where their shuttle trail faded. He knew what he was supposed to do: leave the site, secure the perimeter, and report survivors for later recovery. But he also knew what would happen to a lone alien child if pirates or scavengers came back. She was light in his arms but heavy with fear, and he made his choice. He carried her to a half-destroyed crawler truck and started the engine. It coughed sparks but came alive. The girl sat beside him, wide-eyed, clutching a blanket he had wrapped around her. She stared at the Terran patch on his shoulder and spoke a word he guessed meant soldier. He nodded and said his name slowly. Mason. She tried to repeat it, her accent soft and careful. Smiled. Though his lips were cracked from dust, he told her she would be safe, though he was not sure it was true yet. They drove through the desert plain under a red dusk that turned the sky to copper. The crawler's sensors flickered, showing pirate signals still prowling in the north. Mason shut them off so she would not see. He kept glancing at her, wondering how a child like this could be left behind. He had heard rumors that the Erythians had strict evacuation codes, that anyone too young or too weak could slow the transport, but to abandon a child seemed beyond reason. He thought about his own sister back on Earth, who had once waited for him by the shore when he shipped out, and he felt a hard pull in his chest. When night fell, they stopped near a ridge, and he set up a small shelter with what was left of his field kit. The girl watched every move, her silver eyes reflecting the glow of the portable lamp. He offered her a ration bar and water. She sniffed it suspiciously, but hunger won and she ate in tiny bites. When she finally looked up, she whispered something again, then pointed at him and then at herself. Mason guessed she was asking for his name again. He tapped his chest and said, Mason. She touched her chest and said, Leary. He repeated it and she nodded. Later, when the wind rose and the cold crept in, she shivered. He wrapped her in his thermal cloak and sat near the entrance with his rifle ready. The stars came out one by one, sharp and endless over the barren. Sky. Leary's breathing slowed until she slept. Mason looked out at the darkness, thinking about what he had done. He had broken direct orders, abandoned his unit, and risked court-martial, all for one lost alien child. Yet somehow it felt like the first right thing he had done in years. He remembered battles that had blurred into each other, planets that looked different, but died the same way by greed and fear. He had seen too many civilians left behind because someone higher up said they were not part of the mission. Now he looked at Leary and thought maybe the mission had found him instead. She stirred in her sleep, murmuring words he did not understand, and he placed a steady hand near her shoulder to let her know she was not alone. When dawn came, the horizon burned gold. Mason packed the gear and checked his map. The nearest Terran outpost was destroyed. The next one was 200 kilometers east across open desert. He could try to signal for pickup, but the pirates would hear it too, so he decided they would move on foot at first until he could find a working beacon. Leary followed close behind her bare feet, quiet in the dust. He showed her how to tie the cloak around her shoulders and how to drink from the filtered canteen. She watched and copied carefully like a soldier learning drill. They walked until the sun climbed high and the air shimmered. Mason told her stories to keep her calm, though she understood few words. He told her about the oceans of Earth and the taste of salt wind and how ships once sailed without engines guided only by stars. She listened and smiled faintly, as if trying to imagine waves and gulls. He thought maybe one day he would show her if they both survived. By afternoon they reached a canyon. Filled with wreckage of old transports, Mason searched one hoping to find a working comm unit. Inside he found only scraps and bones. He was about to give up when Leary touched the control panel and the screen flickered to life. Her fingers moved lightly over the symbols and the system responded as if recognizing her presence. Mason stared in disbelief. She looked up shyly and said a single word. "Translate." And the console began to speak in Terran Basic. She had some kind of link with machines. An instinct or gift. Mason realized then that she was not just any refugee. She was something rare and valuable. Maybe the reason pirates had raided the colony at all. He also realized the danger was far from over. He looked at her standing small but shining in the dim light, and he made the promise that would shape both their lives. He told her no matter what happened, he would keep her safe. He would get her home or make a new one for her. She looked at him for a long moment and then nodded, as if sealing the promise herself. And in that silent bond, the soldier and the alien child became more than survivors. They became a small, fragile hope in a galaxy that had almost forgotten mercy. The sun rose harsh and white above the canyon, and the heat came quickly, burning the air around them. Mason checked his compass and the small charge cell that still had some power left. The old crawler they had repaired during the night rumbled weakly, but it was enough to move east toward the mountains. Leary sat beside him, still wrapped in his cloak, her small hands pressed on the dashboard as if feeling its pulse. Mason did not ask how, but every time she touched the controls, the machine seemed to work better. The engine that had stuttered now ran smooth as a hum of breath. The desert stretched forever and the horizon shimmered, but at least they were moving away from the wreckage that might still draw pirates. Mason kept his eyes on the scanner, though it blinked with static. The communications net was dead, the radio long out of range. He tried to fix the uplink and muttered a curse when it failed. Leary looked at him curious and asked softly what that word meant. He hesitated, then smiled a little and said it was a human word for when things do not work and you wish they did. She nodded like she understood and said a word in her language that probably meant the same. He found himself laughing quietly, something he had not done in weeks. The sound of it felt strange in the empty world. The crawler climbed a ridge, and ahead they saw a stretch of cracked ground leading to dunes and distant rock spires. Leary pointed toward the tallest one and said a word that Mason's translator half caught: mountain of wind. He asked if she knew this land. She said only a little. She remembered riding a transport over it when her people fled, but she had been afraid and had not looked back. Mason told her she was brave for surviving. She shook her head and said she was not brave, only lucky that he had found her. He told her sometimes luck is just courage in disguise, and she seemed to think about that for a long time. By midday, the heat became unbearable. The crawler's coolant gauge blinked red. Mason parked in the shadow of a boulder and opened the vents. The air shimmered like a furnace. He gave Leary water first, then drank the rest carefully. He tore open a ration pack and handed her half. She smiled and said the human food tasted like metal. He grinned and said that was how soldiers stayed strong. She looked doubtful but ate anyway. Her laughter was small, but it made the empty world seem less lonely. When they set off again, the horizon darkened. A sandstorm was building. Mason had seen storms on other worlds, but this one looked alive, like a wall of gold and smoke rolling fast. He pushed the crawler as hard as it would go, but the wind hit them before they reached cover. The machine rocked violently, sand slamming against the windows. Leary held onto the seat. her eyes wide. Mason covered her with the cloak and tried to steer blind. He could not see 10 meters ahead. The compass spun uselessly. He shouted over the roar, telling her to stay down. She closed her eyes and placed her hand on the control panel again, whispering, "Something." The lights flickered and the crawler's system steadied. Mason could not explain how, but somehow, she was guiding the machine through the chaos. After what felt like hours, the wind began to fade. They came out into twilight and silence. The desert behind them was gone, buried under waves of sand. The crawler stopped at the edge of a canyon. Mason climbed out and looked around, feeling both awe and exhaustion. Leary followed, him clutching the cloak around her shoulders. Her hair was full of dust and her face streaked, but she was smiling. She said softly, "The storm listens sometimes." Mason stared at her, not sure what she meant, but he nodded. He told her she did well and she looked proud. They made camp under a rock arch. Mason set up a small power cell and the faint blue glow pushed back the night. Leary sat close to the light and stared at the stars. She pointed to one and asked which world was his. He told her about Earth, the blue planet full of oceans and forests and people who never stopped fighting for something better. She listened quietly, then said her world was full of light and water towers that sang when the wind passed through, but her people were afraid of the dark. They thought darkness meant danger, so they built too much light and forgot how to see the stars. Mason said maybe that was why she had been left behind, because she could see what others were too afraid to look at. She did not answer, but leaned her head on her knees, thinking. Later, Mason told her stories again to help her sleep. He spoke of old ships and human explorers who crossed empty space with only faith and hope. Leary asked why humans kept going when everything was so dangerous. Mason said because humans hate giving up once they care about something. He looked at her when he said it, and she understood. He saw it in her eyes before she turned away, shyly. The next morning they found the wreck of a shuttle half, buried in the sand. It was marked with pirate symbols, but the body of the ship was still strong. Mason climbed inside, searching for fuel or power cells. Leary followed, tracing her fingers over the metal. She said she could feel the machine's memory, like faint echoes of what it had seen. Mason asked if she could start it. She said maybe if she had. The storm had passed, but its mark remained across the desert. The old pirate shuttle that Leary had coaxed back to life now floated low above the dunes, its thrusters sputtering like tired lungs. Mason sat in the pilot seat, his hands steady on the worn controls, while Leary sat beside him, eyes half closed as if listening to the ship instead of flying it. The machine responded to her touch far better than to his, and Mason had stopped asking how she said she could hear the ship whisper when it hurt and when it was calm, and somehow that made sense to him in a way nothing else did. They flew in silence for hours over endless sand and broken metal, until the radar finally showed a signal ahead, a fringe station known as Outpost 9 built on the edge of nowhere. Mason knew the place by reputation. It was not an official Terran outpost, but a smuggler hub and a resting point for deserters and scavengers. Still, it was the only place within range with fuel and repairs. The ship rattled as they came in for landing, the docking lights blinking weakly. The hangar looked like a rusted cage filled with old freighters and makeshift tents when the shuttle touched down. Mason powered off the systems and turned to Leary, telling her to stay close and say nothing. The people here did not ask questions, but they also did not forgive mistakes easily. The air inside the outpost smelled of oil smoke, and old sweat voices echoed in a dozen tongues, and eyes followed the human soldier and the small alien girl walking at his side. Mason's armor still bore Terran markings, and that drew attention. He kept his hand near his sidearm, though he did not want to use it. Leary clung to his arm, trying to stay hidden under the cloak. Mason led her to a corner stall, where an old mechanic named Harl worked, surrounded by piles of parts and humming drones. Harl was human, once a fleet engineer, now half machine with metal joints and a glowing eye. He looked at Mason and laughed, saying he had not seen a Terran uniform here in years. Mason said he was not here on duty, just needed fuel and sealant for a shuttle. Harl's mechanical eye flicked toward Leary and then back. He asked if the kid was his. Mason said she was a survivor from the border raid. Nothing more. Harl grunted and named a price that made Mason's jaw tighten. But he paid anyway, trading the last of his credit chips, the mechanics, nodded and said he would get the work done within a day. Mason thanked him and led Leary to a small room above the hangar. He locked the door and told her they would stay hidden until morning. Inside the small quarters, Leary looked out the small viewport at the lights of the outpost. Her face was calm, but her hands twisted the edge of the blanket. She asked softly why the people here looked at her like she was something wrong. Mason said because they did not understand, and sometimes fear makes people cruel. She said her own people were the same, afraid of anything different even among themselves. Mason looked at her and said, then maybe both of their kinds had things to learn. She smiled faintly and said, maybe they could learn together. That night, Mason could not sleep. He sat by the door listening to the hum of the hangar below. Somewhere someone laughed too loud. Somewhere else a fight broke out. He thought about his unit, wondering if they thought he was dead or deserting. He knew when they reported back, the command would call him missing in action, and that might be better than a court-martial. Still, the promise he made to Leary felt more important than any order she had been left behind by everyone who should have cared. He would not be one of them. At dawn, Harl knocked with news that the ship was patched enough to fly. Mason followed him down to inspect it. The old engineer leaned close and said quietly, that word was spreading. A bounty had been placed on a young alien female, matching Leary's description. Mason's gut tightened. Harl said some traders claimed the bounty came from Erythian Command itself, and that pirates were hunting for her across 3 systems. Mason asked how much. Harl said enough to buy a small moon. Mason thanked him without emotion, but inside he was already planning. He returned to the room quickly. Leary was sitting on the floor, drawing circles in the dust. She looked up when he entered, sensing the tension. He told her they had to leave. Soon before others found out, she asked why. And he told her the truth, that her own people were offering money for her capture. Her eyes filled with something between pain and disbelief. She said they must think she was a danger that she carried, something they feared. He told her it did not matter what they thought, only what they did next. She stood and said she would not go back to them, that she would rather run forever than be taken again. He nodded, saying they would run, but not forever. They would find a place that could protect them both. When they reached the hangar again, the sky above was turning dark with clouds. Mason moved fast, checking the ship's fuel lines and loading supplies. Leary sat in the co-pilot seat, already touching the console, guiding the systems to wake. A group of smugglers nearby watched them too closely. Mason could feel their eyes calculating bounty against risk. He started the engines, and the sudden roar made them flinch. The mechanic Harl raised a hand in farewell and shouted that he hoped they found something better out there. Mason saluted back and took off. As the ship climbed, the outpost lights fell away into a sea of darkness. Leary leaned forward, watching stars appear like sparks through the clouds. She asked where they would go. Now Mason said there was a mining moon called Velith Prime, a neutral zone far from Erythian and pirate reach. He had been there once and remembered a governor who owed him a favor. Maybe there they could hide, and maybe there he could find a way to make her existence legal so no one could claim her again. Leary listened quietly and then said, "Thank you," in broken Terran. Her voice was soft but sure, and it carried more weight than anything he had heard in a long time. As they drifted into the cold black of space, Mason looked at her and realized she had stopped trembling. Her eyes were fixed ahead, calm and bright, and for the first time since the ruins of the border outpost, he felt like they might actually survive. He leaned back and let the hum of the ship fill the silence, thinking how strange it was that one promise made in the ashes of war now carried both of their futures across the stars. The engines of the shuttle whispered steady now, and the stars stretched like silver threads outside the window. Mason watched them from the pilot seat while Leary slept, curled under the blanket near the console. Her breathing was soft, but he could see the tension even in her sleep. She dreamed of the things they had escaped and of the voices that had once called her a mistake. He knew, because sometimes he woke with the same look after remembering the screams and smoke of battle. He had learned to carry his ghosts quietly, but she was still new to fear, still trying to make sense of what being abandoned meant. He looked at her small form and tightened his grip on the controls, promising silently that nothing would take her again. For 3 days, they flew through empty space, keeping to forgotten routes. Mason avoided all official channels. He had worked long enough in Border Patrol to know how fast rumors spread, especially when money was involved, and a bounty from both pirates and the Erythian Council was like blood in the water. He had hoped Outpost 9 would be far enough, but already they had picked up signals that someone was tracking them. The ship's sensors showed faint pulses from behind, like a hunter's heartbeat. Mason shut them down and flew dark. He told Leary they were playing hide-and-seek, and she smiled, though she knew it was more than a game. When they stopped near an asteroid belt to rest, he began training her how to stay quiet, how to move when danger came, and how to use the comm charm he had built for her. It was a small silver piece shaped like a wing connected to his own transmitter. If they were ever separated, she could call him with one word. He showed her how to press it, how to whisper into it, even if she was scared. She listened carefully and repeated every step until he was sure she understood. Then she asked why humans taught children to fight when they were small. Mason said, "Because sometimes the universe does not care if you are ready or not. So, humans prepare early." She thought about that and said, maybe that was why humans survived so much, because they did not wait for someone else to save them. Later that day, the ship passed through the shadow of a broken moon, and they caught sight of a transmission beacon broadcasting in pirate code. Mason changed the frequency and heard the words clear: bounty increased, target priority, young female Erythian alive, high value. His stomach turned cold. He looked at Leary, who had already sensed something wrong. She said quietly, "They are calling for me." He asked how she knew, and she said the signal felt sharp in her mind, like static inside her skull. Mason realized her strange link with machines could feel even what others transmitted. He told her to block it if she could. She closed her eyes and breathed slow, and after a moment she said it was gone that night, if night even meant anything in space. Mason sat beside her and tried to plan their next step. They needed fuel and food soon, but every port nearby was watched. He thought about using an old military contact, but that would risk exposure. He cursed under his breath, thinking how Command would never believe he was saving the enemy's child. Then Leary spoke suddenly, saying she could find another path. She had been studying the ship's data, and there was a relay line used by traders that cut under the main routes. She said it was dangerous because it passed through radiation zones, but no one would follow them there. Mason hesitated, then nodded, saying, "Sometimes danger is the only safe place left." They entered the relay path the next morning. The light outside turned purple, and the sensors screamed from interference. Mason shut them down while Leary, guided by instinct, the ship trembled but held together. Through the viewport they saw the skeletons of old warships, drifting silent reminders of the last border war. Mason remembered fighting. In that war, remembered how both sides had declared peace, but left the dead floating as warning. He wondered if Leary's parents had believed those lies too. Maybe that was why they had fled and left her. He would never know. Halfway through the route they caught another shadow on radar, a small vessel closing fast. Mason powered down and drifted, pretending to be debris. The pursuer circled, then hailed them, a pirate skiff painted black with red markings. A voice came through, harsh and confident, calling for Mason by name, saying they knew he carried a prize aboard. He did not answer. The pirate laughed over the comm and said they could smell Erythian energy leaking from his engines. Leary grabbed his arm, eyes wide. He told her to stay calm and moved the ship behind a drifting cruiser hull. He waited for the pirate to come closer, then fired the old engines at full burn. The sudden flash blinded the enemy sensors, and they slipped through the debris field unseen. Leary let out a small breath, but Mason knew it was not over. When they reached clear space again, he checked the readings. The pirate had tagged them with a tracker pulse invisible to most systems, but Leary felt it instantly. She said it was like a whisper inside the ship, begging to be heard. She placed her hand on the hull, and her face went distant. She said softly. She could talk back to it. Mason told her to be careful. She nodded and then began murmuring words in her own language. The lights flickered, and the tracker pulse changed tone, until finally it died away. She opened her eyes, exhausted but smiling, saying it would now tell the pirates they were heading in the opposite direction. Mason stared at her, amazed by what she could do. Afterward, they sat together eating what little food remained. She asked him what he would do if the humans found him, and called him traitor for saving her. He said they could call him whatever they wanted. He had made a promise, and promises meant more than orders. She said her people used to have words like that, but they had forgotten them because promises became too heavy to keep. Mason said that was when humans felt most alive, when something was heavy enough to matter. She smiled softly and said, maybe that was why he carried her even when it was hardest. They approached the edge of the radiation zone. The stars grew clearer again. Mason looked out and saw the shape of the next destination, a fractured orbital bridge still holding lights like old candles. It was their only path forward, and he could already see ships gathering near it. More hunters, drawn by the bounty. He powered down the engines and said quietly, "The hunt has begun." Leary touched the comm charm on her neck and whispered, "I will not let them take me." Mason nodded, saying, "Then we fight together." And the hum of the engines rose again, carrying them toward the danger that waited ahead. The stars ahead burned like molten glass as the shuttle drifted toward the broken bridge. Mason had seen orbital bridges before. In old service days, they were colossal chains of magnet platforms, connecting the upper orbit to the surface below, but this one was shattered by years of neglect, floating pieces held together by flickering blue fields. It stretched out like the spine of a dying creature across the black sky, and somewhere in that wreck the hunters waited. The scanner blinked with faint returns, not one but several signatures circling like vultures. Mason kept the shuttle low, using the debris as cover. Leary sat beside him silent, her fingers resting on the console, eyes closed. As she listened to the hum of the magnets, she could hear where they failed and where they still pulsed with life. Mason checked the power cells. They were nearly dry. The ship would not make it far if they had to fight. He told Leary that the only way across was through the bridge field. If they could cross to the other side, they could jump to the neutral corridor that led toward Velith Prime. She nodded, saying the magnets were unstable, but she could talk to them. Guide the power if she stayed. Linked. Mason frowned. He did not like the sound of that. He had seen what happened to technicians who tried to sync with old systems. Too much noise, too much feedback. But Leary only looked at him calm and steady. She said she trusted the machine and trusted him to keep her safe. He wanted to argue, but time was running out, so he only said, "Then we do it together." The shuttle entered the first ring of the bridge, and the air around them came alive with static. Light rippled through the structure, like lightning trapped in glass. Mason's controls jumped and the hull groaned. He shouted that the field was collapsing. Leary closed her eyes and pressed both hands to the panel. Her skin glowed faintly as if reflecting the light around her. She whispered in her own language, and the hum steadied for a moment. The ship moved forward inch by inch. The magnetic coils flared and then dimmed again. Mason guided through narrow openings that appeared and vanished without warning. He felt sweat drip down his neck, and every muscle in his arms burned from holding the controls steady. The bridge seemed alive and angry, but Leary's voice was soft and patient, like she was soothing a wounded animal. Then the sensors screamed again. Several ships were closing fast, pirates no doubt drawn by the bounty. Mason saw their lights flicker in the distance. He pushed the throttle, but the engines sputtered. He cursed under his breath and told Leary to hang on. The first blast hit the side of the shuttle, shaking it violently. The alarms wailed and smoke filled the cabin. Mason grabbed the emergency extinguisher while Leary struggled to keep the power stable. Another hit followed, tearing through the rear wing. They were caught between the failing bridge and the enemy ships. Mason turned to Leary and told her she had to disconnect. They needed to jump. But she shook her head, saying if she let go, the field would eat them both. He saw tears on her face from the strain, and the flickering light made her look almost translucent. He wanted to reach her, but the next blast threw him against the wall. Pain shot through his ribs, and he felt the warm sting of blood. He crawled back to his seat, gripping the controls with one hand. He shouted that she was not alone in that he was there. The words seemed to reach her. She opened her eyes, glowing silver, and whispered his name. The ship's systems surged, and the magnetic field ahead opened like a gate. They sped through the glowing corridor. The bridge, crumbling behind them, Mason fired the forward boosters until the engines screamed. The pirate ships followed, firing wildly, but the debris and collapsing coils took most of the shots. One pirate craft got too close and was ripped apart by magnetic backlash. Mason barely saw it vanish in the storm of light. Leary kept the field alive just long enough for them to break free from the bridge. When the last coil failed, the whole structure erupted in a wave of energy that threw their shuttle clear into open space. The lights went dark and everything fell silent. For a long moment, Mason could hear only his own breathing. He looked over at Leary, who had collapsed against the console. Her pulse was weak but steady. He touched her shoulder gently and whispered that it was over. She stirred faintly and asked if they made it. He said yes, barely. She smiled and closed her eyes again. He patched the bleeding on his side with field bandages and checked the instruments manually. The power core was almost empty, but the navigation system still worked. They were drifting toward the neutral zone, only a few hours from the medical moon. As the ship glided through the quiet void, Mason sat beside her watching. Her chest rise and fall. She looked so fragile, and yet she had done what no engineer could have done. He thought about the promise he made in the ruins that he would keep her safe. He had tried, but it was she who had saved them both. He wondered if that was how promises worked, that sometimes they protected both people equally. Hours passed, and finally the sensors caught the faint signature of the medical moon ahead. Its ring lights blinked like a distant city. The comm system flickered back online, and Mason sent a weak identification code. He got a reply, a calm mechanical voice welcoming him to the neutral sanctuary of Velith Prime. He felt the tension leave his body as he guided the dying ship toward docking range. Leary woke halfway, through descent, and asked where they were. He told her somewhere safe for now. She smiled weakly and said she could feel the machines below. They sounded kind. He did not know what that meant, but he was glad she could rest. When they landed, the medics rushed to meet them. Mason tried to stand, but his leg gave out. They lifted him onto a stretcher, and one of them asked who the girl was. He said she was under his protection and to treat her as family. The medic nodded without question. The last thing Mason saw before he passed out was Leary looking back at him, surrounded by light and people. When Mason woke, the world around him was white and quiet. The ceiling above shimmered with soft lights that pulsed like a heartbeat. He tried to move, but a band of pain wrapped around his ribs and shoulder, reminding him of the battle at the bridge. He looked down and saw medical seals covering his wounds. The air smelled clean and cool. Machines hummed beside him, whispering numbers he could not care about. He turned his head slowly and saw Leary sitting near the window of the recovery ward. Her skin looked brighter now, free of dust and bruises. She was holding a cup of clear water in both hands, staring out at the wide view of space beyond the transparent wall. The medical moon hung above a gas giant, its rings spreading like silver rivers. She looked peaceful, but there was a heaviness in her eyes. Mason called her name softly, and she turned with a small smile. He could tell she had been waiting. She came closer and told him he had been asleep for 2 days. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. The bridge explosion had nearly torn the shuttle apart, but she had managed to shield it long enough to reach the neutral zone. Mason said she had done more than shield it. She had saved both their lives again. She blushed faintly, saying she only followed the hum of the machines. They had guided her here. He asked if she trusted them more than people, and she said sometimes machines were easier. They did not lie. Mason nodded slowly, knowing what she meant. The door opened and a man in a gray uniform stepped in. His badge showed the emblem of the neutral authority, Governor Aylin. He looked at Mason with professional calm and said he had reviewed the report of their arrival and their medical clearance. He also said something else. A message had come from the Erythian delegation. They had identified Leary and requested her immediate return, claiming she was a missing citizen. Under protective law, Mason felt a cold anger rise in his chest. He asked the governor what would happen if they refused. Aylin sighed and said the moon was neutral, but not above galactic law. If her people filed an official claim, it could bring conflict. Mason said quietly that her people had left her to die once and now they wanted her only because of what she could do. The governor looked uneasy and said the council representatives were already en route to discuss terms. Mason clenched his fists and said he would be there. When the meeting came, Leary stood beside Mason in the central hall. The Erythian envoys entered, tall, pale figures wrapped in light armor and cold pride. Their leader spoke with a voice like glass, saying they were relieved to find the lost child unharmed. They called her by a number, not a name. Mason felt her flinch beside him. The envoy said she was needed for a program to restore the Erythian core systems that her neural pattern was uniquely bonded with. Machine resonance. They thanked the Terran soldier for temporary protection and said they would ensure his cooperation was noted. Mason stepped forward and said his cooperation was not for sale. He said she was a person, not a project, and she would choose her own path. The room went still. The envoy turned his silver eyes on Leary and said gently, "She belonged with her kind, that humans could not understand her nature." Leary looked at Mason, then at them. She said quietly that her kind had abandoned her and that she had found something better with someone who kept his word. She said humans might not understand everything, but they cared even when it hurt. The envoy frowned, saying she was confused, influenced by primitive emotion. Mason felt the tension grow, but before he could speak, alarms echoed through the hall. A security officer ran in shouting that pirate ships had appeared in orbit. The governor ordered evacuation protocols. The Erythians demanded protection, and the guards scrambled. To seal the docking bay, Mason grabbed Leary's hand and pulled her toward the control room. They could see through the viewing glass as the pirate fleet approached a swarm of dark ships cutting through the ring lights. The bounty had reached them, even here. The Erythians argued that the human had brought danger, but Mason ignored them. He told Leary they needed to reach the defense grid. She nodded, saying she could help inside the control room. Technicians were panicking. The outer cannons were half offline. Mason pushed through and started giving orders, his old soldier tone returning. He told them to reroute power from the lower decks. Leary moved to the main console and closed her eyes, placing both hands on the interface. The screens came, alive with streams of code. The technicians stared as the systems responded faster than they had ever seen. She whispered in rhythm, and the defense grid powered up its cannons, lighting the dark around the moon. Mason could see the pirate ships breaking formation under the first barrage, but more kept coming. The Erythian envoy entered, shouting that she was endangering herself and demanded she stop. Mason turned on him, saying if she stopped, everyone would die. The envoy hissed that she was there. Property. Mason drew his sidearm and pointed it at him, saying she was free. The envoy froze. The governor appeared behind them, seeing the chaos, and ordered the envoy to stand down. Leary's voice trembled. She said she could sense the pirate flagship, sending a boarding wave. They wanted her alive. Mason looked at the radar and saw drop pods heading straight for the surface. He told the governor to send all remaining guards to the landing zone. Then he looked at Leary, saying they had one chance to end this. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and whispered that she would not let him fight alone. The battle that followed turned the sky into fire. Mason led a squad of moon guards through the corridors, shooting down raiders as they broke through the walls. Leary stayed in the control room, connected to the grid, guiding drones and cannons with her will. The Erythians hid behind the security line, still demanding authority, but none listened to them. The medical staff evacuated the civilians, while Mason fought his way to the outer platform where he could see the flagship burning in the distance. The comm charm on his neck buzzed, and Leary's voice came through, weak but clear. She said the grid could overload if she pushed harder, but it would destroy the pirate core. He told her to do it. She said he might not survive the shockwave. He said, "Promises only matter if they are kept." The sky turned white. The grid fired all at once, and the explosion tore through the fleet. The wave slammed against the moon, shaking it like thunder. Mason fell to his knees, his armor scorched. The pirates were gone, destroyed in a single pulse. He heard silence, and then Leary's voice whispering his name before fading. He rushed back inside through smoke and sparks. The control room was in ruins. The console burned, but she was alive, barely breathing. He carried her out into the corridor, the light flickering around them. She opened her eyes and asked if it was over. He said yes. The pirates were gone. She smiled weakly and said she could hear the machine singing again, but now they sounded peaceful. He held her close, saying she had done more than any soldier or machine ever could. The governor later declared her under Terran protection. The Erythians protested, but the Moon's people stood behind Mason. They had seen what she had done and what her own kind had not. Mason stood before the council with Leary's hand in his and said she chose her world, and her world was with him. The battle smoke had cleared, but the scars of fire still hung across the horizon of the medical moon. Mason stood on the outer platform staring at the wreckage drifting in orbit where the pirate ships had once filled the sky. The metal air still smelled of ozone and ash. His armor was cracked. His body ached and his thoughts were heavy, but he was alive, and so was Leary. Behind him inside the recovery dome she rested under the soft hum of the machines she had saved. The governor had declared her an ally of the moon and a symbol of hope, the first non-human to ever be given Terran protection. Mason still remembered the faces of the Erythian envoys when they heard the decision, their cold eyes unable to hide the shock they had left quietly. And he knew they would not forget, but for now she was safe. And that was enough. Days passed and repairs began. Mason helped the engineers rebuild the defense grid. Though his rank had been stripped by Terran command for disobedience, he did not care. They could take his badge but not his word. The Moon's people treated him like a hero even though he said he was only doing what was right. When Leary finally woke, the first thing she asked was if the machines were still. Singing, Mason smiled and said they were. But now they sang songs of peace. She laughed softly, her voice still weak but alive. She told him the machines had whispered something before she blacked out, that they had seen a human who kept his promise, and they trusted him. He did not know how to answer, so he just said, maybe machines were wiser than people. The days grew calmer, and Leary began to walk outside again, wrapped in a long coat to hide the faint glow of her skin. Children of the Moon followed, her curious and unafraid. She smiled at them and sometimes made small toys move without touching them. It became a game that filled the air with laughter. Mason watched from a distance, feeling something warm in his chest he had not felt in years. He realized he had stopped counting missions, stopped worrying about duty, and started living one day at a time. He even built a small home near the northern ridge, a quiet place overlooking the gas giant's rings where the light changed colors. Every hour Leary helped decorate it with bits of broken circuits and wires, turning them into art. She said broken things still had stories if someone cared to listen. But peace was never simple. Word spread through the outer systems of the girl who could talk to machines and of the human soldier who defied orders to save her. New visitors came, scientists, traders, even reporters, some with gifts, some with hidden motives. The governor tried to shield them, but power had its limits. One evening, Mason returned from patrol to find an encrypted message on his terminal. It was from his old commander warning him that Erythian agents were moving again, this time not with fleets, but with diplomacy. They planned to appeal directly to the Galactic Council to reclaim Leary as a national resource. The message ended with a single line, "You cannot win this by force." Mason sat in silence for a long time, then went to find Leary. He found her by the ridge, watching the sunset turn gold against the glass towers. He told her what he had heard. She did not seem afraid, only thoughtful. She said, maybe this was how her people asked for forgiveness, not with kindness, but with control. Mason said, forgiveness meant nothing if they still wanted to own her. She looked at him and said, then she would choose her home before they chose for her. She wanted to speak to the council herself, not to beg, but to tell the truth. He wanted to refuse, afraid of losing her, but he saw the fire in her eyes and realized this was not a child anymore. She had grown through fear and battle into something stronger. The hearing took place through holographic link, the council chamber filled with delegates from dozens of worlds. Leary stood in the center of the moons, broadcast room with Mason beside her. The Erythian representatives appeared on one side, polished and cold. The human admirals appeared on the other, cautious and curious. The council chair asked who would speak first, and Leary stepped forward. Her voice trembled at first but grew steady as she spoke. She said she had been abandoned, not because she was weak but because she was born different, able to hear what others could not. She said a human had found her when no one else cared, and that he had taught her what her own kind had forgotten, that promises matter more than power. She said she did not belong to any world but to every machine and every heart that still believed in mercy. The chamber was silent when she finished. The Erythian envoy tried to argue that she was a national project, that her ability was created by their science, not nature. Leary only smiled and said, "Science might build power, but it cannot create compassion. And compassion is what keeps galaxies alive." Mason looked at the screens and saw faces softening, even the human admirals who had doubted him. The council finally voted to grant her independent status as a free citizen under Terran protection. The decision sent a wave of reaction through the galaxy, but in that moment Mason felt only relief. Leary turned to him and said quietly, "We have a home now." He nodded, unable to speak. Months later, the medical moon built a small academy for new engineers, where humans and Erythians could study together. Leary was the first instructor teaching about machine empathy and communication. She often told her students that machines only echo what people feel, so the real lesson was learning kindness. Mason took a post as a security officer, though most days he spent helping her fix old drones or exploring the valleys beyond the ridge. They lived simply but happily, and the world slowly forgot the bounty and the war. The people called her the girl of the bridge and him the soldier of the promise. One night, as they watched the stars, Mason asked if she ever missed her home. She said maybe, but she had found a better one. He asked what she meant, and she said home was not a place. It was a person who never leaves when everyone else does. He looked at her and saw not a frightened child, but a symbol of what made humanity worthy of the stars. She smiled and said softly that the machines still sang, but now they sang his name. He laughed quietly and told her, maybe that was because they liked good stories. She laughed too and leaned on his shoulder. The night sky stretched endless above them, filled with light and quiet promise, and in that peace, their story finally came to rest, complete, whole, and true.